Hello and welcome to the Women Fantasy Authors YouTube channel. I'm Janet Hanker and I am speaking with Palmer Pickering today. And we met at BayCon in July and had a nice conversation. And I spotted her epic fantasy novel. I loved the description and the book cover, so I knew I needed to read it and have her on. So welcome, Palmer.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you. So I must say that this is epic fantasy with a capital E. It's over 700 pages, and I absolutely devoured every page. And when it was done, I was ready for more. So don't let the 700 plus pages discourage you from checking this out, because it's absolutely an amazing read and really enjoyed all of it. So I'm glad we connected. I wanted to say that I really appreciated the fact that your main characters are middle-aged. We meet Telio at the beginning of the story, who is a retired soldier, and he's now working as a stonemason, and he's very talented at what he does. So tell us what he's working on when the story opens up.
Yeah, so Telio is working. Let me show you the book cover.
Yes.
Yeah, so he is Heliotrope. He is working on a mosaic for the Queen. He is making a mosaic of a pear tree on her private terrace.
Yes. And who is watching from the tree?
Oh, I can't tell you that. Well, I guess I can. Yeah, so he's being spied on basically by the prince, a young prince. So he's got a little audience. And so, yeah, that's kind of the setup. It kind of a quiet royal garden, peaceful scene. Kind of a slow, I get a lot of comments that it's not your typical fantasy opener because it's not, dropped in the middle of a battle, right? It starts out, with a tradesman, and an artist. He's making a piece of art and in a quiet, serene environment. So yeah, it's a little bit different. But the first chapter does lay out a lot of the foundations of the story to come. Yeah.
I actually appreciate that about it. It was really nice, the details in your story. We'll talk about that a little bit later, about your world building. So the Queen is so pleased, she asked him to repair the stonework on the practice yard for the guards. And that's where we come in contact with our first heliotrope. It hasn't been used, it's broken and dusty. And I want you to talk about what the heliotrope symbolizes and why it's so important to this story.
Yeah. So heliotropes are a mosaic, a large stone, a patterned yard, with a patterned flagstones or different types of stone making up a pattern of concentric circles with diamonds and, kind of a fancy floor you might see in Las Vegas or something, or in a fantasy game, RPG game. And in a boss arena, for those of you who are video gamers. So it's so one thing is Telio, who's the main character, the retired warrior / stonemason. He is descended from a line of mages, right? And magery was outlawed generations ago when the mages and the stone warriors fought and created a war, and chaos ensued, and eventually magic was outlawed. And but he's descended from mages, but it's so this heliotrope was part of the mages kind of practice, if you will. And that's part of the discovery that you kind of go on the journey of discovering, because it's been forgotten about, right? There's some reference to them. Telio and his cousin have like old manuscripts that have been passed down that talk about them, right? But they're not commonly understood anymore. It's just a stone floor, basically, right? So part of the journey of one of the themes and subplots is discovering the lost magic of the mages. Yeah.
Right. Now, did you find anything historical about something similar to what you presented in the book, in terms of patterned stones that might have been from from an older time period?
Yeah. Well, there are lots of influences. Wicca has like the 5 star, a lot of times, and you'll see in kind of different types of conjury, people put candles on floors in certain patterns, and in a lot of classic fantasy books, there's a magical confluence of energies in certain locations, in certain towers, and where the different lines of the land meet, and so there's that. My inspiration actually came from, I love art, I love architecture, and I was inspired by the Islamic floors in their palaces and in their houses of work, their mosques, right? There's very intricate mosaics that are in the mosques, and there's one pattern in particular, and there's a lot of photography of these mosaics because they're so beautiful and colorful and intricate. There's one that if you look at it, it gives you a optical illusion that it's spinning. So that was one of the big,
That's
that was one of the big inspirations for that.
Yeah, that's great. I was, your writing is so descriptive. I could actually visualize the movement of the stones, and that brings me to the next concept is that the mages, the mages that are we meet during your story, do something called dance the sword or dancing sword on the heliotrope.
Mhm.
And when you were describing the actions, it reminded me of a martial arts kata. And I'm wondering if that's kind of where the inspiration came from.
Yes, yes, indeed. In fact, directly, a more direct inspiration are the Chinese films, the genre of films called wuxia. And
Okay.
if you think of, I think it's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or Hidden Dragon, Crouching Tiger, I can't remember which, but where the swords women are flying through the trees, and so it was that, and it was the sword forms in martial arts. So yes, kind of a combination of the two, where it's almost a spiritual practice as well as an arm, as a martial, as a arms, soldier practice, right? And then the part about the wuxia where they're actually flying is, you get a bit of that when they get more advanced and dancing the sword, they're actually, levitated off the ground, and, kind of easy to leap through the air and things like that. So it definitely, from the martial arts and the wuxia influence in there.
I loved how it touched on that. I could totally see it from both the films, and also I took a martial arts class a long time ago, and my instructor did a beautiful kata with a staff, and it reminded me a lot of what you were describing. Yeah, yeah. Now, at this point in the story, now I believe that I'm not giving away anything. I think this is in your description that there's a coup at the castle, and Talio has to leave with the prince, and we find out more about that later. And also a young man that he saves, who was basically a prisoner from another kingdom and was there as a slave, and then they take off because their lives are all in danger. The prince especially, because the people that are doing the coup want to get rid of the entire royal family. So tell us where they're headed and a little bit about Dinsmora.
Okay. Yeah. So they flee, and Telio's cousin, who's Dinsmora, she is also obviously considered cousin. She's also descended from mages, and she's a healer and an herbalist, and she lives by herself out in the forest, and she's kind of woven kind of a magical ward around her, barrier around her little domain. And so they go there for healing. Jessam, the foster orphan boy, he had suffered a sword wound, and he takes them there, and the people who instigated the coup are going to be after the royal, heir. So he has both of these young teenagers or mid teenagers in tow, and he's now suddenly found himself in charge of these two. And so Dinsmora is a very interesting character, and I don't flesh her out that much, but she's one of my favorites, and she could kind of deserve her own point of view character, for sure. because she brings in, she has an affinity for animals. She kind of like communicates with birds and owls and, the crow or ravens. And she kind of communicates easily with the horses. And she gathers her own herbs and she tans her own hides and spins her own flax and weaves her own stuff. And she embroiders these kind of mystical patterns in her cloak, which kind of make her, somewhat sort of invisible, hard to see. So she's just a very interesting character for sure.
Right, right. I really loved her a lot. I really, really added a lot to the story. I wanted to jump here over to talk about your world building because it is so rich and detailed and lush. Actually, as I was reading it, I could see it in my head almost like I was watching a movie. And some of the scenery that you were describing, especially when they're getting up into the mountains and the ruggedness and the snow and the peaks. I was just in Alaska, and some of it reminded me of what I saw up north. And I'm wondering if the world that you created was inspired by any places you've actually visited here.
So the valley where they start is a fertile valley, sort of almost a Mediterranean climate. And there's three kingdoms in this book. One is the Green Valley, or the Verdant Valley, where it starts, and then there's the Blue Mountains, and then on the other side is the Green Valley, or sorry, the Blue Valley, which is the Sapphire Valley. So there's the green and the blue, Verdant and Sapphire, and then the Blue Mountains, which are very rocky, high peaks. And that's sort of, I modeled that after the Rockies.
Right.
Yeah, the Rocky Mountains. And also a little bit in trekking, in the whole snowbound thing was a little bit, we're both from California, a little bit of the Donner Pass
Oh,
kind of
yes.
story, right? Where the mountains here around Tahoe, what is it? The Cascade Range, it's the lower Cascade Range. They get, snowbound, the passes close, they'll get like 30 feet of snow. And, if you go off trail, there's a story of the Donner family. I don't know if everyone's familiar with it. Basically, during like the pre-auto times, when they were coming out in caravans, they had tried to cross the pass or they hunkered down in the pass for the winter and ended up all like starving and stuff because there was no snowbound. So it was a little bit of that as well, about rugged terrain, winter. I grew up in the East Coast, actually in northern New York, where we would be heavy snows and winter sports and snow plows and that whole thing. So I get into it's kind of a little bit of a riff on the winter scene as well there. But yeah, in terms of visualizing, this book and my other series, the Moon Deeds series, are written in a highly descriptive, visually descriptive style. My intention is I see it very cinematically, and my goal is to capture those images that I have into words and transmute them in such a way so that the reader then sees the images that I see, right? So going from imagery to words to imagery, right? So the trick is, how do you get words to communicate a visual information, right? It's a tricky thing, right? And so that's my goal. And so I'm glad that you saw, what, the whole scenery and all the landscape and whatnot. I did that on purpose. Now, some people, I want to warn people who are watching this, some people don't like that style at all, right? They want more plot driven action, action, action. They don't need all the details. They want to fill in a lot of the stuff themselves. They just kind of want little hints. So it's more in the vein of like a Robert Jordan Wheel of Time style of writing, which goes on and on about, the travel and the horses and what they're eating and, what the clothing looks like. I go into that. It's that style of book. Some people love that. They love being immersed in that and really feeling like you're there, kind of slice of life-ish at time, slow burn. That's the style that it's done in intentionally, which I do know that some people dislike that style quite strongly, but people who like it love it, so.
I really love that style because I'm real interested in the development of the relationship of the characters. You have some wonderful stuff describing relationships to animals, especially the horses, which is I love horses, so that was a really nice piece. So I really appreciated that, and so that's a disclaimer. If anybody doesn't want needs all battle 24/7, then this is a little different. I wanted to say also bring up the importance of stones in the story. There's a lot of magic imbued in the stones, and Telio is a master craftsman, and so he knows about that. And there's also other stones that are used for different ways. Tell me a little bit about the stone guardians and how they travel through stone. Where do they get their magic from?
Yeah. Yeah, let me just touch a little bit on the battle thing though. So it does have battles in it. There is in fact quite graphically
Yes.
described battles and sword fights and blood and gore. So you'll get these bursts of very descriptive action and like I said, graphic blood and gore. So it's not devoid of that. It's just not that all the time. So yeah, so stone. So there's a couple of magic systems. One is the mages who dance the sword around the heliotropes, and you'll discover some stuff at the end, or other things that it does that don't want to really necessarily go into for spoiler reasons. But then there's another. I mentioned the magic wars before when magic was outlawed. It was the battle between the mages, battles to the death between the mages and the stone guardians. So the stone guardians were another type of magic wielder, and they were more elemental magic, where they understood stone to the point that they could kind of merge with stone and manipulate stone. And so that's another, and I kind of get shivers thinking about it. So that's another kind of thing that gets uncovered and discovered throughout this journey very unexpectedly. But they do encounter stone guardians at a certain point in the beginning of part 2, I think. They have to go through guardian territory. But a lot of this you'll discover as you go, because people just thought stone guardians were myths, that
Right.
your grandparents would just say to scare you, you better go to sleep or the stone guardians will come, that kind of thing. But but their magic still exists, and there's discovery around that. So yeah, there's one style of the writing is that it's not omniscient, it's third person omniscient. So you're seeing everything through Telio's eyes. So there's not an info dump of how things work, because no one in this society knows how things work anymore in terms of magic, because it's been outlawed for so many generations. There's just kind of hints and pieces, and people are discovering little pieces of it separately. And so you would discover along with Telio what's still active, what's still possible, and how to tap into it. There's no basically formula, or it's not common knowledge basically.
Right.
So that's part of the fun, is to discover this stuff.
Yeah. Going back to the battle stuff, because I wanna emphasize something that really stood out for me, because Talio is not only a great warrior, but he was also very strategic in what he did. The battle scenes were incredibly well done, especially the kind of the bigger one towards the end. And I'm wondering, did you actually study battle strategy and sword fighting to make the scene so visceral and real?
I do a lot of research for my writing, and that's part of the fun of it for me. So I did do research on sword fighting techniques, swords themselves, because there's also forging. There's also swordsmiths, in the book, and blacksmiths, and so I studied sword making. And yeah, some battle techniques in my previous series, or another concurrent series, Moondeeds. I studied a lot about hand-to-hand combat. Krav Maga and basically, outlawed moves in karate and stuff that will kill
Mm.
you, and I was just, YouTube is amazing because you could watch hand to hand, you could watch battles in hand to hand fighting in like judo tournaments and stuff. You can watch them and I could slow them down and see how they grab that person, what they do. And you can't really watch real sword fights, you can see them in the movies, but you're not going to watch a death match, but you can watch hand to hand combat in martial arts. So yeah, I definitely did study a lot to, and how, I studied, for example, how the carotid arteries work, and how long I looked up how long does it take to die, if you cut off the blood
Right.
flow to the head, and you have to get both arteries or just one, and how long, and so yeah, there's a lot of information out there, and I'm like, I hope the FBI isn't like tracking my Google search terms, because how do you strangle blah blah blah.
True. We have to look up in our writing careers, we have to look up some pretty odd stuff, especially if it relates to death and dying. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, how
I
many
understand.
minutes does it take to actually, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you
Um,
did mention a couple other things. I don't know if you were going to
yeah.
bring them up. You mentioned the animals. So the animal companions, that's a trope, right? They're not the true magic animal companions where like you don't talk to the animals, although there's a very close relationship. One of my a reviewer did think that they talk to the animals. They called them talking animals. And I'm like, they don't actually talk, but Dinsmore understands them as though they're talking, but it's not like they're talking in English, right? And there was a very close bond with Telio and the horses. So he could read their behavior and their signals and their whinnies and, stuff like that. So it's real animals, they're not, talking animals. But they're characters in and of themselves, right?
Yes.
There are various types of animals. And so that was really fun. And then with Jessam, the fosterling, the orphan, that whole found family dynamic in Telio's original family.
Right.
I don't know if you wanted me to touch on that a little bit, or if you wanted to ask about that.
You can, let's just a little short background about what Jessam's journey is in all of this, without, we're trying to avoid any spoilers, but yeah.
Yeah. So Telio, and you learn this pretty early on, I think in the second chapter, Telio, or maybe even the first chapter, I don't know, Telio. So in this, there was a war between the Sapphire Valley and the Verdant Valley in the past, which Telio during his service fought in, which has since ended. But one of the practices of war in this world is that sometimes they would raid villages, medieval-ish, they would raid villages, they would kill everyone, but sometimes they would kidnap the young boys and take them back as slaves. And so Talio's family had been massacred, but his son went missing. His young son went missing. And you'll see in the beginning of the book, he had in the past had gone looking for him for a few years and unsuccessfully, never found him. Now, Jessam is an orphan that was stolen from the other side and was brought back by Telio's side people. And so there's that heart connection. And then there's the found family dynamic of grieving. There's a theme throughout the book of grief and loss, right? And healing around grief and loss. So he's grieving his family the whole time, and yet stitching together a new family. And so there's a very heartfelt theme throughout, and that's one of the primary plot lines and themes of the book.
Yeah, it's very poignant, and it tells us a lot about the characters through that grieving process of family. Before we have to close up here, I want to share your information, and so people can see about your other books, how to reach you. There's your webpage, and also you also write science fiction. So I see there's some other books out there. You want to just briefly talk about those?
Sure. It's actually science fantasy. I call it fantasy in a science fiction setting.
Oh, great.
There's
okay.
a lot of magic, and a lot of the magic systems are based in shamanism.
Excellent.
There's plant spirit medicine. There are some shamanic journeys and trials, particularly in book 2. There's another character, sort of like Dinsmora, which is their mother. These are twins. Their mother and Cassidy has inherited. So she was an apprentice to her mother for plant spirit medicine. So in both Dinsmora and Brianna, who's their mother, is based on a friend of mine, an actual plant spirit medicine woman who practiced in the Sierra foothills for a while, and I dedicated, in fact, Light Fighters to her. She's since moved to the East Coast mountains out there. So there's that whole thing in there as well. Very, very different. Deals with some harder themes, such as human trafficking, and starts with a dystopian Earth in the near future, and then they flee to a moon colony. There's black market stuff. There's this very long arc. It's going to be a multi-volume series around finding our ancestors on a lost planet across the galaxy. So that's the long arc.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. I look forward to reading those too, because I'm obviously very in love with your writing style. It was stunning. Really, the book was stunning. I loved it. And when I got to the very last page, my thought was, okay, what's next? I want to know what's next. So is there going to be a next?
Yeah, so it's a standalone. It does wrap things up in a not necessarily a traditional way. There are a couple of primary plot lines which are not necessarily resolved in the happy ever after thingy. So those open plot lines could certainly, continue on in another book. But this is being marketed as a standalone. I have no idea when I will ever get to another book. So, but I do have a name for the next book, if there is one, which is called Stone Guardians.
Yes. Okay, that's good. And I can just read this again because it's so rich and full of so much stuff. I'll just read it again, and then maybe one more time. We'll see. We'll see what
It
happens.
is out an audiobook too, on Audible. George Goodell is the narrator.
Oh, I bet
He's a very well-known narrator. He's narrated hundreds, thousands of books. So
that's
yeah.
good. Yeah, I'll have to do that next instead of reading. When I'm traveling around, I can listen to it. Well, listen, we do need to close up. We're about out of time, and I'm so glad that we met and we had a chance to talk about this. Maybe when I get through one of your fantasy sci-fi mashups, we can have you come back. Palmer, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Thanks so much for your time.
Okay, take care.
Bye.